Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Good evening, if you're in Canberra, as Chris Gregory is, one of our speakers. Thank you for joining us at this LSE research seminar on anthropological theory, a series that this term we are devoting to the works of our late friend and colleague, David Graeber. I'm Alpa Shah, a professor in the department here and chair of this series. Last week, we discussed the book based on David's doctoral ethnographic research, Lost People. Today, we move on towards an anthropological theory of value, the false coin of our own dreams. Or perhaps we should call it, as David wanted, the false coin of our own dreams towards an anthropological theory of value. It was first published in 2002 by Palgrave in New York, 5 years before Lost People, though it was actually mainly written afterwards. To me, this book sets the tone and ambition of what is to follow in David's later work, and especially the just published Dawn of Everything, with which we started this series. For this 2002 book is really David's first kind of bold attempt to provide a new theory of almost everything, value in particular, and he does so by revisiting classic anthropological approaches and ethnographic cases. The book is Wedding Marks and Mohs, another preoccupation for David, taking a lot of inspiration from the late Terence Turner, David's teacher. It's very wide-ranging: magic, power, religion, structure, history, dreams, desire, everything is there. And from here, it's also clear that anthropology and politics, by then David was quite involved in the anti-corporate globalization movement, that they cannot be separated for David. But I've already said too much about the book, and we could spend an entire day on it, actually, though we have only the next hour and a bit. We have actually far more qualified and brilliant interlocutors today, to whom I must hand over. So let me introduce them to you. We'll start with Chris Gregory, who has a very fascinating history as an economist turned anthropologist. In the 1960s, he spent 9 years studying business and economics and working for the Australian Iron and Steel. And in 1973, he went to Papua New Guinea as a lecturer in economics. And he says he left 3 years later as a student of anthropology. His PhD followed at Cambridge. It was in economics, but explored colonial economic history and economic anthropology of Papua New Guinea. The book from this work is Gifts and Commodities, a landmark book that all the anthropologists in this room will know. In 1984, he became, he joined the ANU, Australian National University Department, where he is currently emeritus professor, and he's joining us now from Canberra. The year before he took up this post at ANU, he was actually here in our department, and he was working as a research fellow with the late Alfred Gell on an ethnographic study of the tribal marketing system of Buster in central India. This formed the seeds of his ongoing research on the rice economy and culture of Buster, a place that he's kept visiting over the years. In fact, with a Buster-based colleague, he is currently finishing up a translation and analysis of a 31,000-line oral epic that women sing during a rice harvest ritual about the birth of Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess of wealth. I should say that also in the 2010s, Chris lived for 4 years in Fiji, he says, as the trailing spouse of the High Commissioner, where he used his time to work on kinship and economy of the Indo-Fijian cane farmers and family firms. Chris's publications, there are so many, include books and articles, all in the general area of political and economic anthropology, and, you know, observing the economy, savage money, Lakshmi Jagar, The Quest for Good Life in Precarious Times, to name a few, to give you a flavor. So as you can see, there is no better person, except perhaps our equally accomplished second speaker today, to comment on David's book on value. So let me turn to Don, just to give you a brief introduction to Don, and then I'll hand over to Chris. Don Kalb studied anthropology and history at Nijmegen in the Netherlands in Anton Blok's department. As a student, he was very involved in the squatter movements and the first anti-neoliberal stirrings before we, I guess, knew that word. And he turned from being an anarchist to a Marxist because of the influence of Dutch historical sociology line in development studies. And I think this transition makes him, his engagement with David, particularly interesting. Don's initial research was on the failure of the new economic policy in Russia in the 1920s and working class rebellions in Netherlands in the 1920s in the Shoemaker region. Between 1990 and 95, Don undertook his PhD in Utrecht, where he continued his historical anthropological work on Dutch working class formation, work that resulted in a landmark book called Expanding Class, which he, looking at Phillips in Eindhoven, transitions from from Fordism to flexible familism, wrote about class, generation, gender, critical junctions before the word intersectionality was being used, accumulation regime, so very wide ranging. After this, he started working in Poland with the Ford Foundation, leading a Ford Foundation project on the social costs of economic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe. In 2003, he was the first senior hire at a new department that was set up at the Central European University in Budapest in the new Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And he worked from there until 2018, supervising more than 20 PhD students. And it's here that he developed his interest in the rise of the right in post-socialist Europe, alongside his kind of theoretical ongoing work on critical globalism, anthropology and history, Marxist anthropology, vernacular politics. Between 2014 and 2018, he had a very close affiliation with the Max Planck Institute in Halle. Chris Hahn, it is very nice to see you here. A financialization project and book on financialization relational approaches that they worked on together with a whole team of researchers. So over the years, Don has worked in many collaborative projects, edited many co-edited books, End of Globalization, Critical Junctions, Working Class Populism in Neoliberal Europe, a book on urban commoning with Mao Malona, who will be joining us later in the series on the Bullshit Jobs session, and the Anthropology of Class. Now, since 2018, he has been professor of social anthropology at the University of Bergen, and there he's been leading a project on the front lines of value. So really working on the themes of today's seminar. Now, before I hand over to Don and Chris, I'd also like to add that in 1985, Don started Focal, which is a journal of global and historical anthropology, which was an effort at close left-wing collaborations amongst anthropologists. He's still the editor at large, and I'm really delighted that he suggested that we create a special space on their blog to make these seminars and the written pieces based on them available to future generations. So we will. And Don and Chris, Chris tells me his presentation is 20 minutes and 33 seconds, and Don's is 17 minutes. So over to you, and then we will have a space for comments and questions from the floor. Please do start putting them in the chat if you'd like to as we go along, and then Matthias Pelkmans and I will work together to coordinate the discussion. We'll go on till 12:15, and then we'll have an informal space for a little bit later for anybody who can stay on for a while longer. Okay, over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, good. I confess that the first time I met David, I was deeply unimpressed. It was in 2006 at a conference in Harlem. David gave a 50-minute summary of what was to become his debt book. He covered 5,000 years in 50 minutes, and this was an era when the grand narrative was very much out of fashion. His presentation struck me as rambling and incoherent. I thought he was, to use the language of my colleague who was raised in Elephant and Castle, a muddle-headed wombat. Or, if I may use the language of my Australian heritage, I thought he was a bullshit artist. Over the past 15 years, I've come to change my mind about him completely. I've just published an article where I've argued that Salins and Graeber should have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. For many, this is high praise, but I can't be sure that David would agree. He would probably regard it as a dishonor to be accorded the same status as the high economic priests of Wall Street. When I use the word bullshit as a mode of evaluation, I choose my words carefully. David's contribution to the theory of value has been to change the terms of debate. He's taken a word like bullshit from the tea room and brought it into the seminar room, thereby exposing our academic double standards. Hitherto, we have spoken one language in the tea room, as in that paper today was complete bullshit, and another in the seminar room where more polite language is used. As we shall see below, David was not the first academic to realize the significance of the concept of bullshit for a theory of value. One of the uncomfortable implications of his theory is that bullshitting is an occupational hazard of the academic's craft. We are not liars, but we're also capable of talking nonsense sometimes, David included. My brief today is to discuss his book Towards an Anthropological Theory of Value, not his book on bullshit jobs. I shall keep to that brief as best I can. I must say, however, it was only after reading his books on anarchism, debt, direct action, and bullshit jobs that I began to get my head around the central argument of his value book. What struck me about all these books was the extraordinary unity of theme and content. I see them as a 5-volume study of the value question. I'm not saying this is the best way to interpret what he has done. There are obviously many ways to approach his work. This is just the one I find most useful. By my count, these 5 volumes contain 500,000 words. Today, I'll be concerned with just 3 of his words: bullshit, false coin, and dream. These are the key concepts that David uses to change the terms of debate about anthropology. I begin with the latter 2 as they appear on the subtitle of his first book. In his acknowledgements, David thanks everyone at Palgrave Books, except the editor who made him switch around the title. If we restore the order he wanted, the main title becomes The False Coin of Our Dreams. The origin of this expression can be traced back to Mohs and Herbert in their general theory of magic, but David gives the metaphor a 21st century twist. As I see it, the phrase false coin of our dreams defined a paradox that is a central organizing metaphor of all 5 volumes of his book on value. The question is, what does he mean by this paradox? My short answer is that he's referring to the political battle over those big ideas that can change the world. For him, the value question is about the battle over competing images of wealth. The false coins are the images of wealth produced by the dreamers of yesterday. The false coin is of an image that has become adulterated and debased through excessive use over time. David, the old-fashioned dreamer, wants to recoin these debased images of wealth, to create a new image of what could be. His dream is not a fantasy. It's a real possibility grounded in economic history, cultural geography, and the political present. David the dreamer then is a political activist who wants to appropriate the false coins of the ruling elite, melt them down, and forge something new. So what is this image of wealth? This visual image captures the essence of his approach as I understand it. It shows the charging bull sculpture that artist Madicchia secretly installed on Wall Street in 1989 in the wake of the 1987 Black Monday stock market crash. In 2017, Kristen Visbal installed her sculpture of Fearless Girl, facing down the charging bull. But following complaints, the fearless girl was relocated to a different part of Wall Street. This visual image, which gives meaning to the anthropological notion of point of view, can be read in a number of ways. I restrict myself to just two here. Greta's blah, blah, blah is a quote from a song very popular among the young. The other line goes, yeah, yeah, yeah. The language of this song is not double Dutch, even though the elite might think so, given that the composer was a Dutchman. It raises the serious question of what no more blah, blah, blah means. What is this message the young are trying to convey with lyrics of this kind? Enter David Graeber, the bilingual Wall Street ethnographer and native. Not only has he learnt the language of the bulls and the bears inside the offices of Wall Street, he's also learnt the language of the young protesters on the streets outside in New York, London, and elsewhere. In 2019, he attended the Extinction Rebellion in London. He duly recorded what they said and reported it. The following is my very brief gloss of how he might translate this expression. No more blah, blah, blah is a polite way of saying, tell us the truth about climate change. Stop lying. Stop talking bullshit. Don't give us bullshit jobs to do. We too are capable of imagining different possibilities for life on Earth. If those of you in power don't listen to our dreams, we are all finished. Other F words come to mind. The distinction here between the lie and the bullshitter is a very, very important one, which David mentions but doesn't elaborate. This image, another image from a sculpture, helps us see the point. It's one thing for an academic to talk nonsense in order to impress, but it's another for a politician like Trump who knows the truth and to deliberately propagate falsehoods. Trump is a bull farter. He produces toxic fumes of the kind that endangers humanity. Bulls can also produce manure, which is to say that the academic bullshitter is capable of producing something very useful. We are dealing here with two quite distinct values. The ambiguous quality of the academic bullshitter requires it to be handled with the greatest of care and respect. David does precisely this in his writings. Let me now move to David's point of view and his analysis of the language of those on the other side of the barricade. The bulls and the bears of Wall Street excite the emotions and imaginations of academics as well as sculptors. On the one side, we have those in the schools of business and economics who crunch the numbers and give advice to the politicians and shareholders who run the show. On the other side, we have people like David who occupy the streets and call for radical change. Academics then can be divided into three categories: those who work for Wall Street, those who work against it, and others interested in different questions. It's a quaint feature of the English language that those who work for Wall Street are called policy advisors, while those who work against it are called political activists. Henceforth, I shall refer to them both as political activists. It's obvious then that the schools of business and economics are full of political activists, while anthropology has very few. This raises the uncomfortable question for us non-activists of the political implications of our inaction. Activists in the schools of economics and business come in many different stripes, defined by their approach to the theory of value: neo-Smithian, neo-Ricardian, neo-Marxist, neo-Keynesian, neo-classical, and so on. Most belong to the mainstream neoclassical school, epitomized by the work done by economists at the Chicago School of Economics, a school that has produced 10 Nobel Prize winners, 2 short of Harvard, the top school. The image of wealth that informs the thought of these people, I assert, is the false coin of David's dream, the antithesis that defines his thesis. So the question is, what does this false coin of European economic thought look like? What image of wealth does it excite in the minds of beholders? Here it is. In 1895, Alfred Nobel established the Nobel Prize to be awarded to those who conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. 5 prizes are given each year: physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. In 1968, the Swedish Reserve Bank donated money for a prize in memory of Alfred Nobel. This award, which is administered by the Nobel Foundation, is not a Nobel Prize. However, by the operation of the law of contagious magic, it is falsely called the Nobel Prize in Economics, when in fact its real name is the Swedish Reserve Bank Prize in Economic Sciences, in memory of Alfred Nobel. Nobel's descendants are very unhappy about this state of affairs. In 2000, they demanded, unsuccessfully, that the Nobel Prize name be dropped from the Swedish Bank Award because they said Alfred Nobel was highly skeptical of economics, and as such, the existence of the award was an insult to his legacy. David Graeber and Nobel obviously said certain assumptions about the ability of economic science to confer wealth and happiness upon mankind. I feel, therefore, that while he would reject the Swedish Bank Prize, he would happily accept the Nobel Prize for Peace. As Don has correctly noted, Don Kalb, David is a political activist in the Gandhian tradition rather than the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary tradition. David has a very interesting discussion of tokens of value in his value book, but I fault him for not including a discussion of this token of value, the true coin of the economic scientist's dream, the false coin of David's dream. But David, it epitomizes an impoverished and debased Eurocentric image of wealth. His whole project has been in search for a better image of wealth. For inspiration, he raided the cabinet of ethnographic curiosities, the historical archives, and of course, spoke to the young. He has no new answers to old questions. His concern is to identify the constraints that economic history and cultural geography impose on our capacity to imagine new possibilities for life on Earth. This enables him to pose new questions and to change the terms of debate. He has no manifesto, no commandments, just difficult questions that get to the root of the matter. He is primarily concerned to excite debate about issues of pressing importance for the human condition. If you are looking for simple answers to these questions, you will not find them in David's work. He is no messiah. He teaches us how to think, not what to think. The theory of value is the most hotly disputed subject in economics. If you ask 10 economists to define money, for example, they will give you 10 different answers. However, when it comes to the question of an image of wealth, there is remarkable agreement. This can be found in the image they have selected for themselves to distinguish their discipline. The horn of plenty, the symbol of abundance and nourishment found in European mythology. All 89 laureates have proudly accepted this token as a symbol of the true coin of their dreams. David correctly notes that modern European thought has its origins in the secularization of economic theology. This image of the horn of plenty, which has its origins in Greek myth, could not be a better illustration of his thesis. For the economic scientist, the horn of plenty conjures up images of Adam Smith, their revered founding ancestor, whose book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, sets the agenda. What students of Economics 101 don't learn is that Adam Smith had a labour theory of value, one that excited the thoughts of Karl Marx. Marx's revised version of Smith's labour theory of value was published in 1867. However, around about the same time, William Stanley Jevons and two others were independently working on a new theory of value that turned Smith's labour theory of value upside down. This was a marginal utility theory of value that provided different answers to questions about wages, prices, and profits. Instead of a class-based, historically grounded theory of profit as exploitation, Jevons' theory was based on the figure of an abstract, ahistorical individual making free choices in the market. In came Smith's doctrine of laissez-faire, out went his labour theory of value. For the economic scientist, the labour theory of value is complete bullshit. Marx's political economy has inspired the dreams of Lenin, Mao, and others. Jevons' economic science has inspired the dreams of heretics like Keynes and true believers like Milton Friedman. So at one extreme, we have a very negative Smithian inspired image of wealth. At the other extreme, a very positive Smithian inspired image of wealth. The rest, as they say, was the history of the 20th century. David's concern is the quest for a 21st century image of wealth that puts this Eurocentric image in its place. David's thinking was inspired by the comparative ethnographic literature, which revealed him the common ground of these two different, the two strands of Smithian thought. Political economy, he notes, tends to see work and capital societies divided between two spheres: wage labour, for which the paradigm is always factories, and domestic labour, household work, childcare, relegated mainly to women. Political economy, he notes, gives primacy to abstract time on the labour floor. David wants to turn this upside down and give primacy to the creative thoughts and actions of people engaged in the process of reproducing their society and their children in a culture of their making. As a contribution to thinking in general about the value question, David's work is not original. He is careful to acknowledge his debts to the many anthropologists who inspired him, especially his teachers at Chicago, Terry Turner and Nancy Munn. He also acknowledges the work of many others who he has critiqued and developed, such as Marilyn Stern and indeed myself. Over the past 2 decades since he wrote his book, many other anthropologists, such as Hart and Hahn, have developed important new approaches to economic analysis that put human beings at the centre. What distinguishes David's contribution, it seems to me, is that his 5-volume study of value is the most radical and most ambitious. David's life work, which now amounts to some 15 books by my count, is nothing less than the whole socio-economic history and cultural geography of the human condition. It is a study of economic theology of wealth as well as the political economy of wealth. He finds much economic theology in European political theology and much economic political economy in non-European economic theology. His concern with what our image as wealth has become and with the signs of hope of what it can become. One of David's concerns, for example, was a deep cultural history of the secularization of European economic theology and the extent to which the secularization is unfinished business. European political economy from Petty in 1662 to Marx in 1867, for example, is full of talk about father labour and mother earth as the creators of wealth, but no mention of God the Son in the form of a weak god named baby Jesus or baby Zeus suckling their mother's milk, as in the Greek myth. This partial secularization of the myth not only devalued women as mothers, it has also devalued males as sons as a supreme form of wealth. This is a truly great revolution in human thought. I know of no male-centric economic theology from the non-European world that goes this far. Note too that the horn of plenty in the Smith-Marx political economy tradition contains surplus commodities, and that in the economic science, we move from surplus commodities to scarce goods, and this of course is, it's precisely this point that Silence reimagines with his new myth about the origin of the original affluent society. This is a line which David develops. So too, I find it interesting that the priestesses in India with whom I work, their myth of wealth and happiness gives pride of case to Mother Water, not Mother Earth, Mother Water and Daughter Rice, their image of poverty and misery to wife-bashing husbands and jealous co-wives. My time is almost up. If I had another 20 minutes, I would show how an image of wealth is just one component of any theory of value. It needs to be complemented with concepts and theories that are historically specific answers to historically specific questions. I would then use this general conceptual framework to interrogate some of the nitty-gritty arguments in David's book. For me, his discussion of the Polynesian gift exchange in chapter 6 is one of my favourites because it historicises the question of the obligation to return a gift. The Panama Papers have revealed that the Pacific Islands have become the backbone of Wall Street, a convenient tax haven for the super wealthy to park their money. These super rich virtual visitors to the Pacific have been welcomed thanks to the hospitality of the Polynesian chiefs. I've no doubt that David would accept that his chapter 6 needs to be revised in the light of this new evidence with these. I would also note how David's paradox of value, the fact that bullshit jobs have an exchange value but little or no use value, requires us to formulate Smith's famous water diamond paradox, which has set the whole agenda in economic theories of value. Finally, I would note that his theory of bullshit as a value requires a concept of the shit kicker alongside that of the academic bullshitter and the ruling bull farter. The shit kicker shovels shit, he doesn't create it. Given that David is an incurable optimist, I feel obliged to end on a hopeful note. I detect 4 signs. First, there's a work being done by investigative journalists on the Panama Papers, exposing the lies and secrets of our rulers on Wall Street. Second, there is a legacy of David's ideas. He teaches us how to find manure in the bullshit and to put it to good use. Third, there are shit kickers doing meaningless bullshit jobs who want to do something useful and are taking action. Finally, and most importantly, there are the fearless young women like Greta who are not afraid to speak truth to power. The young, as always, are the hope for the future. They should be the supreme value in any new revised Horn of Plenty. Struggle. Oh, can you hear that? No. Something's going wrong here. Can you hear that? Yeah. Oh. Sorry. Oh.
We
Anyway.
can't hear it. No.
Hmm?
We can't hear it.
Okay, there we are. That's what I want. Well, that's my last slide. The struggle continues. The foolish girl has been removed and reimagined. She's now a young girl promoting female equality in the boardroom. So there's still work to be done. Thank you.
Wow, that was super. So fine a reading, and you've provided us with a way to understand and think with David. Thank you so much for that brilliant presentation. Over to Don Kalb.
You hear me? You see me?
You're good. Good
Yep.
to go.
Very good. Well, mine is much more boring than Chris's. It's also shorter, fortunately. All right. So the title is Constituent Imagination versus the Law of Value. The last 2 decades in anthropology would have been dramatically less exciting without David. Given David's prominent association with Occupy, with the Western left more generally, this is even true for the Western world at large. With the publication of his dead book, also exactly a decade ago, as Keith Hart once said, David became the most famous anthropologist among the general public of our age, taking that long empty seat next to Margaret Mead and perhaps Lévi-Strauss. With the launch of the Society for Ethnographic Theory, the How Journal, and the turn towards open access publishing, David, now world famous, once more stirred up anthropology as well as academia more broadly. It's a bit weird to say this about an anthropologist of the gift, but David literally made history by attacking established centers and practices of power and wealth. While some in this series of seminars knew him well as a direct colleague or friend, I only ran into David a couple of times. I felt it was not easy to get to know him. He seemed a bit solipsistic, drawn into conversation with himself, sometimes mumbling and laughing privately about the sudden insights he seemed to run into while doing so. If you had not been introduced to that intimate conversation before, it was not so easy to enter it, I felt. He and I never had the time to get to that point, for which I am sorry. I remembered these few moments of mutual awkwardness while rereading Toward an Anthropological Theory of Value. Its style of writing reminded me of David's internal conversations and his moments of private enjoyment. The narrative of this book meanders, feels sometimes elliptic, as it does in all his books. The flow of the argument regularly gets punctuated. Jolts of joyful energy seem to pull the author in multiple unexpected directions. The possible connections that emerge from the words that he happened to choose seem to seduce him all the time to leave the path and get into the bush around it. David, who celebrates creative freedom, is certainly the Zizek of anthropology. As with Zizek, things can become very detailed within a narrative that was already far from linear. As a reader, you may feel you are being unduly slowed down, even taken advantage of. But David can also take you by the hand while making a reckless jump, allowing you for a moment to tower over a conceptual landscape where most people would normally be lost. And you are struck by the sudden clarity of perception. I now imagine that such seemingly reckless jumps were his moments of private enjoyment. Now, my discussion here of an anthropological theory of value must be short. I will leave the bush aside. The book has long chapters on gift-giving societies in Melanesia, Madagascar, and among Amerindians. Some of it very interesting, some of it less compelling for non-specialists. And I will focus on the landscapes that emerge during those conceptual jumps that he makes. This book is not just representative of his writing style and his counterintuitive rhythm of discovery. It also partly lays out the toolkit of concepts and perspectives that was going to dominate his later work, as Chris so well showed. In fact, it offers an embryo his full program of research. What is then David's theory of value? How do Marx and Mohs cohabit in it? How do his very outspoken Chicago teachers, Marshall Sahlins and Terence Turner, figure? And what are its possibilities and blind spots? And this all in a few minutes. David developed his anthropological theory of value against the intellectual and political background of what he calls the bleak 1990s. He's very explicit about it. Neoliberal hegemony, globalized capitalism, economics as dominant social imaginary, post-structuralism, and the reduction of politics to creative consumption identity, both in anthropology and other social disciplines. Structure and history had gone out of fashion, he writes. Action and agency had become cynically equated to mere individual market choices. Before '89, Bourdieu had worked out habitus as the connecting concept between structure and agency. Giddens too had been busy with similar issues. Graeber swiftly passes him by for the focus on dominance and games of power that underlie Bourdieu's project. In David's eyes, another symptom of the cynicism that he saw around him. For David, it seems paradigmatic that anthropologists deal with people in relatively egalitarian societies and with people who desire is a core concept for him, to escape precisely such power games. David proposes value as the point where structure and agency meet. And after an interesting interlude on Roy Bhaskar and critical realism, and his thinking in terms of forces, tendencies, and processes rather than objects, David emphasizes that his value does exactly that, setting open-ended dialectical processes in motion. What is this value, and what are the anthropological traditions that help him shape it up? The shortest way to answer that question is to bring in that concept that's all but foundational for David's work: constituent imagination. While he borrows that term from Italian autonomous Marxism, he mentions Fino and Negri, he links it to a long anthropological pedigree that connects Clyde Kluckhohn, Marshall Sahlins, Terence Turner, Louis Dumont, and others, all of whom are discussed in interesting and original ways. Value is what people tell themselves they find important in the realization of their lives. Value is emic, idealist, and dynamic. This seems initially not very different from, let's say, Talcott Parsons, but David wouldn't be Graeber if he didn't loudly refuse the implied structural functionalism. Graeber's value doesn't work to solidify stable social reproduction. On the contrary, it feeds the social imagination, both collectively and individually, and it's both agonistic and liberating. In the social processes that it sets in motion, people die, strive, love, compete, believe, pray, moralize, aestheticize, sacrifice, fetishize, and whatnot. Value is about making differences, ranking, and proportioning. The socio-structuralism, which David, of course, discusses, may be essential for how our language and imagination works, but David, following his teacher Terence Turner, adroitly embraces Vygotsky's generative structuralism and shifts the weight from langue to parole and towards signifying material action. Hence his interest in ethnohistory and the telling and remembering of histories and stories. Stories become part of constituent imagination in action, the practice struggle for individual and collective autonomous becoming. In the end, David concedes that his foundational notion of value is perhaps not that different from Louis Dumont, a student of Lévi-Strauss, except for its emphasis on process, action, and agency. And while the structure of our social imagination is certainly a totality, and as such embedded in the structuration of our societies and fundamental for how we teach our children, how we reproduce ourselves, it is clear that there is enough ambivalence and indeed contradiction within that totality for David. There are inevitably contradictions between desires and pragmatic realities. Constituent imagination often seems more the property, the desire, and the practice of individuals or groups and moieties within societies than of societies as a whole. Where's Marcel Mohs here, David's most basic theoretical and political inspiration? Mohs appears at all levels of David's approach. David spends some very interesting pages introducing him as the key thinker for a non-cynical anthropology and for a humanist left, who famously rejected the Bolsheviks for their recourse to state terror, authoritarianism, and bureaucratic diktat. In the book, Mohs, of course, appears as the quintessential theorist of the gift and of egalitarian societies, which are for David the self-evident object of anthropology. David may criticize him for his romanticism, but he fully embraces his notion of everyday communism as the glue of all human sociality. Then there's also the basic methodological notion of the total prestation, where the full quality, the core values of a whole society are reflected in each and every of its parts, including the imaginations and actions of its members. David does not discuss it explicitly, if I'm not mistaken, but he does seem to think that Mohs' approach may be too static for his purposes. The constituent values for which people once congregated as a distinct group and created societies may become corrupted over time, and people seek repair. Interpretations will differ. Agonistic and liberating conflict will ensue. Holism, for David, therefore does not take away the dialectics. On the contrary, it feeds them and are fed by them. In all of this, Graeber seems to follow Terence Turner closely. And indeed, in a much later introduction to a collection of Turner's essays, David remarked that he wrote value in order to make the notoriously complex texts of Turner understandable for a wider public. The value book was thus originally intended as a gift to Turner. But Turner was strong on Marx, indeed perhaps the most outspoken Marxist in the anthropology of the 1990s. And Marx was strong on totality and dialectics too, but of a less idealistic kind. David in this book sets a Turnerian Marx into a dynamic conversation with Mohs. How does that work out? A Marxist will immediately wonder how the thoroughly idealist concept of value that Graeber clearly is onto will connect with Marx's similarly dialectical, but certainly not idealist conceptions of use, exchange, and surplus value. Graeber is sympathetic to the young Marx, who wrote on behalf of the emancipation of humans from their self-constructed religious fetishes, which he wanted them to begin to see as the mere products of their own powers of creative imagination, rather than as the gods that they had to obey. This indeed corresponds perfectly to David's own agenda, as his long and interesting discussions of fetishism in this book show. But the post-1848 Marx of Capital and Labor receives rather short shrift. David repeatedly complains about that convoluted language of Marxists. He does not like the Marxian vocabularies and prefers, for example, to talk about creative powers rather than about labor, a term that hardly appears in this book on value. Marx, for David, is mainly interesting, he says, for his approach to money. And here we find an early announcement of the coming book on that. He emphasizes that for Marx, value and money are not the same. But in the next pages, Marx's value disappears and David gets stuck with money and prices, which are, of course, a holistic system too. With Terence Turner, he embraces the idea that socially necessary labor time, a core element of Marx's law of value, is also inevitably a cultural construct, but the Marxist discussions about that concept are not referenced in this book as they are by Turner, nor does David seem aware that this is value operating behind people's back, rather than first of all their own constituent value choice. In Chicago, David was apparently not exposed to Mohs Postone. He also does not seem aware of the energetic value debates among Marxist theorists of the 1970s, in particular Diane Elson, whom Turner had read closely. When we look at the number of pages dedicated to such discussions in this book, Marx's value appears as intellectually much less compelling than Kluckhohen's, Parsons, or Dumont's value. Socially necessary labor time and David's handling is then reduced to a rather static cultural concept for determining via prices how important we find particular items of consumption as compared to other items of consumption. Cars, for example, in the late 1990s in the US were 7% of yearly consumer expenditures. David's example. David's Marx now seems to be primarily about consumption, not unlike the way David's teacher Marshall Salins looked at capitalism in Culture and Practical Reason. It is also as if David at once forgets about his discussion of Roy Bhaskar and his own declared embrace of forces, tendencies, and processes. Socially necessary labor time is a dynamic dialectical relation between abstract capital and abstract labor, and indeed also a dynamic dialectical cultural construct working behind people's back as they do their work for capital. It is the basis for Marx's law of value, which Marx knew well was not a law, but a tendency. Labor productivity would systematically be driven up in the competition among capitals and in the class struggle with labor via mechanization and automation, among others. In the process, labor would lose any sovereignty over its own conditions of life and social reproduction. It would be forced into ever more education or face devaluation and degradation. And the same would be true for cities, regions, and states that could not compete within a globalizing capitalism and would therefore literally be up for grabs. David could have used Mohs and the gift for a deeper anthropological and relational twist to Marx's rather flat notion of use value. But Marx is never allowed in this book to play on his own unique strengths. In the end, both capital and labor, the two elementary positions whose combination produces not just use values and exchange values, but indeed surplus value, the returns to capital, which is nothing less than the key driver of social change in a capitalist world, simply disappear. According to David Harvey, Marx sees capital as value on the move. But in this book, that sort of value just moves out, only to be rediscovered big time in his later work in the form of mass indebtedness and bullshit jobs. Constituent imagination is David's core concept. It was a concept that came from Italian Marxist post-operaismo authors who were impressed by labor's refusal in Italy to work for capital in the Italy of the 70s and 80s after they had lost a series of violent confrontations. Young workers now preferred to seek the creation of autonomous worlds of life and labor outside the wage nexus. This is shortly mentioned by Graeber, and he imagines, like James Scott, that his egalitarian groups similarly refused to further engage with hierarchical power centers and moved out to constitute their own desired societies inspired by constituent egalitarian imagination. However, Italian Marxists such as Antonio Negri always kept the development of capital and the state in dynamic tension with the autonomous desires of his multitudes. In Graeber's value book, they and that dynamic tension disappear. David's egalitarians are on their own, engaging in a similar constitutive metopraxis that Marshall Salins has been criticized for. See also Johnny Perry's discussion a week ago of lost people for a similar disappearance of the IMF and therefore of global capital in David's analysis of recent Malagasy histories. They are sui generis. David in this book firmly dismisses appadurized regimes of value notion for his neoliberal fixation, for appadurized neoliberal fixation on consumption. Pederai recently returned the compliment by claiming that David's anthropology was an entirely traditional one. I think that David did a fantastic job in giving 21st century anthropology a new pride in focusing on egalitarian desires and popular values of autonomy in rejection of the rule of capital. But the Pederai is right in one way. The values David envisions are emic, singular, particular, idealist, and deeply place-based. The book has no references to Eric Wolf, Immanuel Wallerstein, or anyone else dealing with space and multi-scalar dynamic analysis of the dialectical value processes associated with globalized capital and the ensuing popular struggles and desires. There's no political economy at all, except of the journalistic kind. David later massively improved on that lack with the Dead Book, which also brought long-run and deep global histories back into anthropology. But while that book is prepared in this text via David's interest in Marx and money, it is not yet conceptually or methodologically anticipated. And I wonder how David later looked back on this very traditional anthropological theory of value he develops here. David was a magnificent and creative utopian and moralist who was uniquely in tune with the resistant Western mood of the times, from the alter-globalists to Occupy, including in his embrace of the small-scale utopistic mass refusals and moral outcries that we have seen in the last 20 years, including in the desire for autonomy and the condemnation of the overall bleakness of things. But he did not at all anticipate the rise of the populist right, which is also very much about value and values, and must also be understood from within the failures of the earlier left mobilizations of which David and many of us were a part. And in the excitement of retrieving some pride for the discipline, in value, we also seem to have forgotten some of the earlier advances in the anthropology of complex societies and of world society, including some Marxist ones, which are precisely about value.
Thank you so much, Don. Very much in the spirit of the Friday Anthropological Seminar series and also the series that we wanted to set up for David, a tribute to David, which is a true critical engagement with his work. And I guess in the spirit of that, we need to open up for questions. You can use the raise hand function, which is on the bottom of your screen, to ask if you would like to say to intervene. It can be a comment or a question. So I can't see everybody on my screen, so I would please, Patrick Foreman, I can see you putting your hand up, but if others could use the raise hand function on the screen itself, that would be very helpful, because I can't see everybody on the screen at one go. I would love to engage Don and Chris together in conversation. Actually, I'd love a response from Chris on Don's critique and his reflections on what Don has said, especially in light of you know, the little girl at the end of your presentation, Chris, and the fact that she had to be moved, right? She was moved and she becomes incorporated into the boardroom. So what is our message? How do we take David forward? What is our message to the young people in this room and beyond? You know, how, you know, what do we take from David? The possibilities that are offered, different ways of imagining the world, while at the same time, you know, incorporating some of the issues that Don highlights. So it would be great, Chris, to hear a response from you. You don't have to respond at this very minute, but it would be great to hear from you. I will let Patrick Foreman, you had raised your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself?
No.
I can't see you on the screen.
There's a question there from Mary Tracy to everyone.
Yes, there's a question from
Anyway,
Mary.
so as far as, I mean, clearly my thinking about the value question comes from my own history of approaching the issues, being raised in the my issue is looking at the whole notion of what I call the image of value, as any theory of value presupposes some sort of image of value, and so any value question is at once prescriptive and descriptive, and that image of value there with Marx, it comes in the very first sentence of his book. The wealth of nations, I forget the exact quote, it goes something like, the wealth of nations, the wealth of all societies is a massive accumulation of commodities. So you have an image. And so for me, as I see what David is doing, he's saying we've got this political economy model, but there's the non-European world. And for someone like myself who spent in fact, I remember when I first got into Marx, it was a great liberation to move from studying neoclassical economics, which is boring. That's probably the worst thing you can say for it. And then it was incredibly liberating when I was in Papua New Guinea to read Marx. But it struck me that when I looked around Papua New Guinea, there were no industrial factories, not many people working. And it's a very, and so this is when I got interested in anthropology and some of the wonderful work that was coming out there by people like Marilyn Strathern. Some of her best work is called No Money on Our Skins, about Hagen migrants in Port Moresby. No one reads that, but it's an absolutely magnificent thing, and it really gets you thinking about what's going on. So for me, having been brought up in that heavy theory, for me, I struck the ethnography was just absolutely wonderful in terms of expanding our imagination, enabling us to see radically different ways of doing things. And so, so then, in fact, well, my image of wealth was in gifts and commodities. And on that score, it's really wonderful to be critiqued by David, because he is a person who takes other people's ideas very seriously and is extremely generous. And not only that, but he can move you on in your own understanding. I think as an academic, three things can happen. You get ignored, which is the worst possible thing. You get misquoted, or when you get critiqued by David, it's very enlightening. Then and David makes that point. Marx is, for understanding his conception of value, is the sense in which Marx was brought up. I mean, in terms of the history of thought, he's quite conservative in that sense, that from Petty up until Smith, up until Marx, that was the orthodox tradition. The Labour theory was value there for 4 generations. And the revolution, or counter-revolution, however way you see it, I see it as a counter-revolution. Clearly, Marx developed, Smith was engaged in a commercial economy, then Marx takes us to an industrial capitalist economy. But there's lots of other forms of value in the world outside of that, which is precisely what David is trying to do. So for me, then, it's the David's critique of a lot of this value is really a classic traditional anthropological critique. Let's look at this geography and how do we transcend that. So yes, so no one's going to deny that the Marxist theory of the commodity is an important thing, but it's only part of the story. And indeed, there's, and then so the issue for me then is, and I'll speak through the issue for David is, and the issue for all great revolutionary thinkers. At the time, Smith was a revolutionary thinker in terms of laissez-faire. Marx is a revolutionary thinker at his time. But we're now at the beginning of the 21st century with this massive climate change problem, which, and Greta is speaking truth to power there. And we've got to totally reconsider how we think about value and our place on Earth. So that'd be my little rave.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. We've got a very good question from Rachel Smith in the chat. Rachel Smith, do you want to unmute yourself? Rachel Smith. Sorry, I can't see you, Rachel.
I've got could Chris and Don expand on the step from false coins to debt? It seems Chris sees continuity and Don revision. So Don, you can have a chat now. Over to you. Unmute, Don.
Don, you need to unmute yourself, please.
He's having trouble.
The bottom of your screen. Left bottom.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you very much. I think this is a super interesting question. Yeah, that impression has been made. I don't think there's theoretical revision in the debt book as compared to the value book, but there is methodological revision. So, I mean, the debt book is you know, grand scale work. And so the very playful ethnographic value idea that drives the value book, constituent imagination, is twisted into a completely new light, right? And so what you get is a set of very different visions and a set of very different methodologies of dealing with the big issue of debt. And then you get, I think Ray indicated that last week very well. And then you get much more structure rather than you know, and structural values rather than histories of value or stories told and purely emic sort of knowledges. You get much more pattern through history. And so it becomes, in a sense, a much more structural book than anything the value book had. And so, yes, I think there's a certain theoretical continuity in thinking about value. And I've actually criticized the debt book as a book about modes of morality without modes of production. It's a bit mean, but it's the same sort of thing as I'm trying to say here now. But nevertheless, it's much more structuralist, much more patterned, much more large scale, much more world history literally, than anything that is hinted at in the value book.
Thanks. Chris?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the thing for me in if we see that David's antithesis is the ruling idea, the ruling Smithian paradigm of wealth. I mean, you can see you can read the debt book. You know, one of his primary things is to what happens in a lot of economics when they try to locate their theories in a more comparative perspective or a historical perspective. They, talk nonsense, and really the whole basis of of that book is to show that the myth of barter, which informs, in fact, the whole theory and all that stage development you find, is simply wrong. Of course, it elaborates that again and again, and that's, of course, in his latest book. So, I mean, I think he's, among other things, he's an economic historian and a cultural geographer. And so he's got a unique rhetorical style. It's not logic chopping in the Marxian style. It's not narrative history in Polanyi style. It's a sort of meandering, a style that you could, it takes a while to get used to. And it's easy to mistake him sometimes for being a bundle-headed wombat, but he plays around with things. He takes you up cul-de-sacs and gets you thinking in new ways about things. So what I see David as doing, he's not a theorist in that classic sense, and he just wants to stir up the pot and get us thinking in new ways and expanding our possibilities. And I think he's a visionary, you know, he's and a political activist concerned about the human condition. And I think he's concerned, you know, about tomorrow via today and the past. So yes, the debt book will be discussed next week. So I look forward to hearing what I think Keith is having a chat next week.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Keith, who's here with us, and Maka Suarez, who's also here with us today, will be leading the seminar next week. Holly High has got actually a really good question about David's writing. Holly, are you with us? Would you be able to unmute yourself and maybe pose your question yourself, please? It would be lovely to see you. Holly?
Where's Holly? What's happening to the sound?
Unmute is not allowed.
Yeah, I've got hers here, I think. I can read it for you. Thank you.
Nice.
But
hang on.
Second, Chris's move to nominate.
Is it possible to mute Holly? Then it would be nice to have her. Okay. Well, sorry.
I'm muted. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
They were really great presentations. Thank you, both of you. So I don't really have a question. I was just thinking about writing, and I love Don's comments about what it's like to read David Graeber, and the phrase when you were talking, like it's like adventure writing or travel writing when you're traveling in ideas. And I often find when I'm reading David's work, I feel like I get a lot out of it. And then afterwards, if somebody says, what was that book about? I'm like, oh, you know, impossible to summarize, you know, cannot say what was in that book, but it was like an adventure just to read it. So I just wondered if either of you wanted to say anything more about writing, especially Chris, I was thinking about, because you were talking about bullshit and shit kicking, and I can't remember what the other one was. So of course, when I was trying to formulate this question, I was thinking, well, some people would just say, well, wasn't David just a bullshitter then? Because if, you know, he never, you know, because he's so hard to summarize exactly what he was saying, and it felt like he was just meandering ideas sometimes. Certainly,
you know,
yeah.
I you know, the point I was making there about the ambiguity of, you know, manure is valuable and it's a high use value. And I think, you know, that distinction, he introduces that in his book, but it's a very important distinction. And for me, the greatest problem now is lying. You know, I just find it really, Trump has raised that to higher levels than secrecy. And this is really a, you know, we've got a pandemic of, and it's the politicians who gave that. But I think and that there's a whole book now written by Harry Frankfurt on bullshit, which is a really fascinating discussion of the distinction between lying and bullshitting, which he says is about trying to be impressive. And I think, you know, the academic scene is about trying to be impressive, of course, because if you're not impressive, you're not going to get a job and so on. So that, but there is there's an ambiguity about bullshit in that it can be good. And I think that's what I find amazing about David, you know, it took me a long time to get into the value book because, you know, the first few people you meet are Nancy Munn, Terry Turner, and Marilyn Strathern, three of the most difficult books in the history of anthropology. But David has this amazing way to go through and really, you know, find the treasures in those people. And in fact, he sort of goes against the grain a lot of the time. So so what was your other post? Anyway, that'll do. But I think with the yes, his writing style is quite unique, and it's a bit like you know, Levi-Strauss in a way. You wade through all this stuff and you reach the end and you don't agree with the conclusion, but you've learned a hell of a lot along the way because of all the new myths and stuff you've learned. So I find with David, he's sort of, it's the journey that's important. And then he'll go up a cul-de-sac and look around and check things out and keep moving on. All the time trying to think about things, and to, what I see him is trying to do is to find there's a limits to our imagination. What is constraining our imagination? What is constraining our capacity to think about new possibilities, to organize life and move ahead?
Yeah, I also want to say something about writing. Am I in the picture?
Yes, sure, Don.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. Thank you, Holly, for picking this up again. And it is pretty essential. At some point in my text, I call it David's rhythm of discovery. And I think it's interesting to think a little bit about that. So the sort of Zizekian writing for David is certainly a method of discovery. And while perhaps, let us say, 60 or 70% of the steps aside that he does are not that generative, 30% certainly is. And it leads to vision and to real discovery. And as you know, in anthropology, discovery is never just empirical discovery, right? It is a combination of conceptual and empirical discovery. It's dialectical in that sense. And so David's writing is, in a sense, very liberating for the capacity of an anthropologist to do discoveries. And I actually think that in anthropological education, we do not talk enough about discovery, and we do not talk enough about the connection between a sort of liberatory Zizekian writing and our skills in actually making discoveries, identifying them and giving them a name. And David is really great in it.
Thanks, Don. We have, I think, time for one final question. And I'm going to call upon Edward Abbs, who's put a really good question in the chat. Edward, would you mind unmuting yourself, please? Edward? Okay. Edward Abbs is at home in the US, where everyone is sleeping, so he doesn't want to wake them up. That's fair enough. I'll read out Edward's question. I wonder if Don could repeat or say something more about what he says is left out or ignored in David's book and Ideas About Value. That is, the Marxist idea of value being created behind people's backs, surplus value, rather than as people's projection or objectification, as in Graeber's version of Terry Turner's ideas. So the question is, can there be a coherent theory of value that incorporates both notions, or as Dan puts it, a dynamic tension between these two forms of value? So Don, over to you for that.
Well, yeah, it's really about that core concept of constituent imagination, and a constituent imagination that is driven by values of autonomy and desires for autonomy. It is a great concept. It's a mobilizing concept, constituent imagination, and value, how David projects it in there. But the idea that just our pictures of our desires, our dreams of our desires, can lead us to constitute ourselves and our lives in a sort of fully autonomous way. It's of course complete bullshit. right? I mean, the whole Marxian dialectic of people being free to make their lives, but not under circumstances of their own choosing, is essential. Now, I don't want to make too much about socially necessary labor time and all these necessarily rather technical Marxist concepts, but what they all do is emphasize and give a dynamic and a perspective on that issue of not under circumstances of our own choosing. Now, what is traditional about the value book, and it is not about that book and the things that come later. What is traditional is that David tends to stick entirely with the native's point of view, right? It's basically going back to Beachian culturalism, and indeed to Marshall Salence's metopraxis. Well, you know, I do metopraxis every day, but my world does not necessarily completely transform along the lines that I project there, that I imagine there, that I desire there. And so it's that dialectic that needs to be brought into a vision of value. So my values are important, but my values also have a background. And yes, they are antagonistic and agonistic and resistant. And my values are not, and my desires are not, let's say, synchronous with the desires of the system. But nevertheless, I have to struggle with the system to realize them. There's a perennial struggle. I always talk about everyday politics. We move all the time, and we do. And in that, we learn about the system, not only about our constituent imagination. So constituting that imagination is a fight and a struggle, not just with our own little societies, but about the big world society that globalized capitalism has created. Right? And so yeah, that is what I think a theory of value must do. It must be dialectical in that sense of making our own world, but under conditions not of our own choosing, and not with the resources that we would like to have.
Thank you, Don. We will now, I want to close the session just to say a great thanks to Chris and Don, Chris Gregory and Don Carl, for this very, very fine presentations, a fine tribute to David. So thank you so much. I'm sure David will be so happy, and we will stay on. We will take a minute's break, and for anyone that wants to hang on informally, please come back in a couple of minutes to speak with Chris and Don. There are some excellent questions that are there in the chat. Michael Reinsborough has a fantastic question. We can continue the conversation in the seminars to come. Keith Hart and Maka Suarez, not next week, which is our reading week, but the week after, so the next Friday, same time, not a week, 2 weeks from today. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you. It's lovely to see you all, and thank you for being with us today to celebrate David Graeber.